All righty, ladies and gentlemen, the hour has arrived. Everybody, the hour has arrived. Good afternoon once again, and welcome to the Center for African American Studies 10th Annual Conference. Thank you again for finding some time to celebrate and engage with us today. A few minutes from now, I will introduce the legendary Dr. Angela Davis, who will be delivering our afternoon keynote address. Before doing so, I'd like for you to know that lunch is now available. Y'all done already figured that out. And, wait, good Lord, where was I at? Lunch is now available in the room next door. But of course, unlike past conferences, food is not served cafeteria style because of COVID-19. Also, ladies and gentlemen, if you feel cramped or if you feel that there are too many people here in this room, there is an overflow room across the hall in the Rosebud Theater. A number of people are already over there. You can watch Dr. Davis's talk from there, and you can easily spread out. You can also watch in the room next door here. If you have not received one already, you will receive a short questionnaire about this program. Please fill it out and hand it back to one of our social work interns after Dr. Davis's talk has concluded. You can also leave them at the registration table. Ladies and gentlemen, please fill out the survey. This is a part of our unit effectiveness program that we've got to have data for the university about our programming. I must give 3 big thank yous before introducing Dr. Davis. For 10 years now, the School of Social Work has remained a tremendous supporter of the Center for African American Studies. Once again, a huge thank you goes to Dr. Deborah Woody, Senior Associate Dean in the School of Social Work, for supporting this event today and many, many others over the years. I also want to give a big shout out to Dr. Brian Samuel, UT Arlington's new Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. He could not be here in person today, but Dr. Davis's virtual visit to our campus would not be happening without his support. In lieu of speaking, Dr. Samuel asked that I read UT Arlington's new Native American Land Acknowledgement Statement. It reads as follows, ladies and gentlemen. UT Arlington respectfully acknowledges the Wichita and affiliated tribes upon whose historical homelands this university is located. Their ancestors resided here for generations before being forcibly displaced by US settlers and soldiers in the mid-1800s. We recognize the historical presence of the Caddo Nation and other tribal nations in the region, the ongoing presence and achievements of many people who moved to the area due to the Indian relocation program of the 1950s and 60s, and the vital presence and accomplishments of our Native students, staff, and faculty. Last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, I have to give a big shout out to my uncle, Michael Bailey, back home in Cleveland, Ohio. He has played golf with Dr. Davis's brother, Ben, since the late 1960s when Ben played for our beloved Cleveland Browns. For decades now, I have heard the story of Dr. Davis visiting our family business for a few minutes on their way to the airport. It is most certainly a cherished family memory. Dr. Davis will do an abbreviated lecture for about 15 to 20 minutes. After that, there will be 2 different Q&A sessions. The first will be led by Dr. Jandel Crutchfield, an assistant professor in the School of Social Work. She is a leading example of the scholar activist. She organized and led a campus march through our campus and the city of Arlington following the murder of George Floyd. She also has a stellar publication record that addresses conditions facing African Americans. The second Q&A will be led by Dr. Mia Kirby, who also holds a joint appointment in the Center for African American Studies. She will present a few questions of her own, as well as those from some of our colleagues and friends from across the university. With that, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce the legendary Dr. Angela Davis. Through her activism and scholarship over many decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in movements for social justice around the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis's teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College, and UC Berkeley. She has also taught at UCLA, Vassar, Syracuse, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. Most recently, she spent 15 years at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she is now Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program, and of feminist studies. Dr. Davis is the author of 10 books and has lectured throughout the United States as well as Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experience in the early 1970s as a person who spent 18 months in jail and on trial after being placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. She also has conducted extensive research on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Like many educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to educational institutions. Having helped to popularize the notion of the, quote, prison industrial complex, she now urges audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. Ladies and gentlemen, with no further ado, the legendary Dr. Angela Davis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shelton. And first, let me express my gratitude to the Center for African American Studies for having invited me to join you in your 10th annual conference on the state of Black America. Of course, we are more than halfway through Black History Month, which I see as a period during which we devote an intense examination, we devote our time to an intense examination of questions related to how far Black people in the Americas have progressed on the journey toward freedom, whether we have moved forward or backwards or remained in place. In this short opening presentation, I want to think about some of the deeper meanings of Black history. And as we observe Black History Month all over the US, and as ever larger numbers of people celebrate Black history at different times of the year all over the world, we recognize that the struggle for freedom conducted by African-descended people for the last 4 or 5 centuries has come to stand in for the deeply human quest for equality, justice, and democracy all over the planet. And of course, Black history is also integrally related to indigenous struggles, to freedom quests of other communities of color, and to a freedom quest of people in the global South. And of course, the struggle to save the very planet we inhabit. And of course, now we are moving through the 21st century. So that means we always have to bring broader issues of racism and gender oppression and violence and sexuality and ability and nationality in our discussions. We always have to be aware of the intersectionality of struggles. In other words, we cannot assume that our history as Black people unfolds in isolation. But neither can we act as if our history were driven only by the contributions of great individuals. And that means, by and large, great Black men, which of course is not at all to disparage the contributions of the great Black male figures of our history. But I want to insert what you might call a historiographical observation into our discussions this morning. I want to make the point that history is never really driven by individuals. And I would suggest that we stop embracing the great man theory of history, because change happens in history as a consequence of the collective contributions of masses of people. W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out that the Civil War and its outcome, the dismantling of the institution of slavery, even though, of course, we recognize that we can still experience the reverberations of that institution today. But the dismantling of that institution occurred because of what he called the self-activity of enslaved people themselves. Abraham Lincoln was not the deciding factor. The deciding factor was the conglomeration of events and activities carried out by vast numbers of Black women and men who were struggling for their lives and for freedom. Lynching ceased to be an everyday event because of the mass activity of Black people and their allies. And let me mention the organizing work of Ida B. Wells here. Legalized segregation did not end because of the proclamations of US political leaders. It happened because Black people and their allies collectively stood up to dynamite and high-power fire hoses, to police with their vicious dogs, to the KKK and other vigilantes. And I want to point out that we as Black people cannot fully grasp our own history if we fail to acknowledge the global context of Black struggles, the international implications of this struggle. And I think we have to argue for an international perspective that sees narrow nationalism as a limited vision that will prevent us from advancing the cause of liberation. Now, when I was still a student, I attended a speech Dr. King gave in Birmingham, Alabama. And it was around the time of his phenomenal Riverside Church speech, Beyond Vietnam. And this was a relatively small Black audience in Birmingham. And what is most vivid in my mind are the informal conversations that followed that speech, in which people were wondering why we had to focus on an issue so far away from Alabama or the US. I now recognize that Dr. King used his oratory to spark conversations that served as political education among masses of Black people. And, perhaps in those conversations, they remembered what he had said in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And this is a quote that we should all have at our fingertips all the time. Injustice anywhere, he said, is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I mention this today because some people still treat the movement for Black liberation as if it is a discrete struggle, disconnected from other quests for freedom throughout the world. And I have to admit that I am personally somewhat nostalgic about a time when it was easier to demonstrate the connections between what was going on inside the country and what was happening outside. When Dr. King became as prominent and active and as prominent an activist and advocate for ending the war in Vietnam as he was for Black equality. When Muhammad Ali said, "No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word." And when the Black woman performer Eartha Kitt, and I hope those of you who are younger recognize the name Eartha Kitt, when she was invited to the White House by Lady Bird Johnson in 1968, she spoke out passionately against the Vietnam War and almost lost her entire career as a result. It would be many years before she was able to work inside the country as a consequence of her public critique of the war in Vietnam. The point that I'm making here is that at the height of the struggle for Black liberation in the 1960s, there was widespread consciousness of the linkages with struggles in other parts of the world. And for example, the invasion of Cambodia in the spring of 1970 was the occasion of resistance throughout the country. This was also the high point of repression against the Black movement. I myself was placed on the FBI's most wanted list then and charged with 3 capital crimes. Black resistance incorporated and encouraged resistance against the war in Vietnam and its expansion into Cambodia and Laos. There was a kind of political literacy at the time that easily grasped the connection between racism abroad and racism at home. And I make this point because I want us to think more deeply about what is happening in Afghanistan at this moment, about the horrendous damage inflicted by the US military machine on Afghanistan, but also in Iraq and in Libya. I want us to also think about how we can link our struggles against racist police violence across national boundaries. And I would like you to think about how we in the US and in the Americas more broadly can learn from struggles against police violence in South Africa. And especially about the way in which this state violence is linked to femicide and class violence. One of the reasons why Black people's quest for freedom in the United States of America is known and followed and treasured throughout the world is precisely because it represents a universal dream, a dream of equality and justice and freedom everywhere. And of course, it is indicative of a centuries-old battle for freedom and democracy that was first expressed in the effort to dismantle the institution of slavery. And we can think about the abolition, this putative abolition of slavery in 1865 here and 1888 in Brazil. But I want us to turn our attention at this moment on the very first successful abolition movement in this hemisphere. And that occurred in Haiti, where slavery was abolished in 1793. And it was because of the impetus of the Haitian Revolution that Black people and others were able to accelerate the efforts to dismantle slavery in the US. As a matter of fact, as we move forward with our efforts to disestablish structural racism, as we move forward with our efforts to disestablish structural racism in the US, we should be more attentive to developments in IT, which after all, can claim the very first non-racial democracy in the world. Haiti produced the first real democracy in the world. It's always taken for granted that the US is the oldest democracy in the world and that France is the second oldest. But as we know, both American and French democracies recognize no contradiction between their endorsement of slavery and the slave trade on the one hand, and their proclamations of human equality on the other. It was precisely because Black people were excluded from the very category of the human. And it was the Haitian Revolution led by Toussaint Louverture, which gave rise to the world's first non-racial democracy. And I make this point because if we consider the recent political developments in Haiti, the assassination of Jovenel Moïse and the fact that he was replaced by a new prime minister supported by the US, I'm referring to Ariel Henry, we can ask ourselves, why are we not more interested in the political developments that are unfolding in Haiti? Why do we just acquiesce in the way Haiti is routinely represented in the world as what a previous president of this country called an SH country? And I will not mention his name. But what is not added to this representation is the fact that after Haiti declared its independence in 1825, France demanded the payment of 100 million francs to former slave owners and to lenders, which incidentally also included the Citibank of New York. 100 million francs in 1825 would be equivalent to more than $20 billion today. And it was approximately 100 years before Haiti was able to pay off this debt. Now, let me turn, as I try to wrap up my remarks, to the larger question of capitalism. Regardless, I've evoked the billions and billions of dollars that have left Haiti ensconced in poverty. But regardless of how much the structures and commodities of capitalism today define our lives, I can say that if capitalism does not manage to destroy the planet first, it will not forever remain the way economic production is organized in the world. And just as we are encouraged to imagine a world in which our security does not require bodies of armed humans trained primarily to use violence, a world in which our safety and security does not require violent institutions of incarceration, it might also be helpful to imagine a world in which economic production is not grounded in capitalism, in racial capitalism and exploitation. Capitalism has always promoted and benefited from racism and also heteropatriarchy. And I truly believe that it will have to give way to a more democratic form of production. If human beings do manage to prevent the destruction of the earth, we can be sure that more equitable forms of production and of distribution of the world's resources will emerge. There is life beyond racial capitalism. There is life beyond racism and capitalism for humans and non-humans alike. Thank you very much.
Testing. So, Dr. Davis, I've been trying to figure out what I've been feeling all day, knowing that I would be standing here with the opportunity to ask you a few questions. And so I think I'll describe it as overwhelming gratitude to you, my sister, Dr. Angela Davis, for what you shared today, but also for what you've shared in your long journey to change the things you can no longer accept. So thank you. Here's a question. So the vitriol, hate crimes, and what feels like targeted anti-Blackness does not seem to ever let up. How have you and those masses of people that you talked about today remained in this fight for so long? Can you share that with us?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. And I think that we have remained in this struggle precisely because we recognize that one important element of the struggle for Black freedom is to generate hope, is to generate hope as a legacy for the next generation. And if you, and I say this all the time because I like to reflect on the fact that it is absolutely phenomenal that African descended people in this part of the world have managed to pass down that desire for freedom and the impulse to struggle for generations and generations and generations. And I like to use my friend Miriam Kaba's notion of hope as a discipline. Hope is something that you have to create and generate, and it becomes a legacy to be taken up by those in coming generations. And I think we have generated that hope by remaining together. That hope is generated through collective struggle.
Thank you. The discipline of hope. So my next question is about that joint struggle. Sometimes we think the path forward towards justice might be unclear. And among those people who do want progress, there might be a contention about how to make that progress. So give us your thoughts on this statement. Pragmatism is the enemy of progress in relation to our march towards racial justice.
Well, you know, of course, we always have to be pragmatic to a certain extent. But if we are pragmatic to the extent of assuming that the way things are at this moment is the way they will forever be, then of course that is that clearly militates against any kind of progress. And we don't have a formula that will tell us exactly how we must theorize our struggle, the practices that we must engage in order to move toward freedom. We improvise, we experiment, and that is the beauty of freedom struggle. And in that sense, it's similar to music, to jazz, and the ways in which new sources of joy and freedom are created by musicians who individually engage in a practice that must recognize all of the other participants, but at the same time allow each one of them to express their individuality. And I think that it is inaccurate and counterproductive to think of freedom as a target that exists somewhere in the future, as a goal that exists somewhere in the future. But rather, freedom is what we generate in the very process of engaging in that struggle to be free.
Everybody here agrees. So thank you for that. And I have one more question before I pass it over to my colleague. So do you have any thoughts on how colorism within the African American community has impacted our progress at all towards this struggle towards freedom in our country?
Well, colorism is one example of internalized racism. And of course, when we look at the way in which what we call the African American community has been historically established, it is related to the one drop rule, right? And we know during the era of slavery that the condition of the child always followed the condition of the mother. So race, as we conceive it, was not so much a question. It was about the nature of slavery and the fact that as long as the mother was a slave, the child, no matter what color she or he was, would remain a slave. Now let's remember that. But at the same time, I think it's important to point out that lighter skinned Black people have definitely been more privileged, and particularly in certain parts of the South, where light skin was valued as the what one might call the apex of elitism for Black people. I remember growing up in Birmingham and organizations that would not admit people with darker skin, and we all know about the paper bag rule. But I don't want to make it appear as if that is our primary struggle, because there are other examples of the ways in which people of African descent, Black people, dark-skinned Black people, have engaged in the kind of behavior that contradicts our struggles for freedom. I'm thinking, for example, of somebody who sits on the Supreme Court right now and is the most backward justice on the entire panel. So let's be aware of the internal contradictions, but let's not forget that our larger struggle is a struggle that is linked to the quest of people in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, the Palestinian people, for example. So I've always tried to be aware of my own presence in the world, and that precisely because both my mother and father were products of relationships that, and I have to say, my mother was a foster child, more than likely, because of the fact that her mother was sexually abused by her biological father. And I think we need to keep these things in mind. We have to look at, why it is there are light-skinned Black people. But that's the nature of African Americans. It's the nature of the Black population in South Africa as well. It's the nature of the Black population in Brazil. And what is so interesting about Brazil is that the demographics of Brazil have changed as ever larger numbers of light-skinned Brazilians have acknowledged their Blackness. Black to me is a political concept. Black to me represents a commitment to struggle for freedom, not only for Black people, but for all humans who are oppressed, and for non-humans as well.
Thank you. All right, passing it to Dr. Kirby.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I first want to say thank you for all the work that you have done, that you are currently doing. And I also have to say that This is beyond an honor for me as a Black girl born and raised in Oakland, California. This is it. This is the best thing that's ever happened to me. So I'm so grateful to be able to speak with you today. So here on campus, I teach a course called Black Women in Society. And in this course, we talk about the tireless efforts of African American women in the civil rights and social justice movements, and how their efforts go ignored, how their voices were silenced during that time. Sometimes I even mention women who my students have never heard of. And I just wanted to maybe get your advice on what we should do as women when we feel that our voices and our work in social justice efforts are being ignored.
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think it should be the responsibility not only of those who identify as women, but of men and gender nonconforming people, of all who treasure justice and freedom, to acknowledge the historical contributions of Black women. And of course, without the work that Black women have done over the centuries, we would not be where we are today. And at the same time, when I say Black women, I want to acknowledge where we are today in the 21st century and our recognition of the social constructedness of gender, and of the fact that it is not accurately reflected in the gender binary that we are accustomed to deploying when we think about gender. That there's not only male and female, but a huge spectrum, including gender nonconformity. And so, I always point out that the work of trans communities has been so central to the recognition that it is possible to challenge what is so completely normalized in our worlds. If we can challenge the gender binary, certainly we can challenge structural racism. And I think that all of these insights are interrelated. And I'll of course I could go on forever engaging with your question, which is so important. But I do want to point out that Black feminism is not simply about gender identities. It is also about approaches. It is about methodologies. It is about the way in which we can conduct struggle. And that Black feminist ideas and methodologies and approaches can be embraced by anyone who wants to advance our freedom struggle. And one of the really important elements from where I stand is the way in which contradictions can be generative, that we don't have to use the Western logic of always choosing one or the other, not either or, but as Patricia Hill Collins said, both and. And that is so important for us as scholars and as activists.
Thank you. Thank you. So since you've mentioned scholar activists, I have a question from my colleague, Dr. Frederick Ingram, who is duly appointed in the Center for African American Studies and Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. Dr. Ingram asks, how should we balance being a scholar activist when working in unsupportive spaces?
Oh, a very good question. And I know that people have asked me how I lasted so long within the academy. Particularly when I was fired from my very first job in 1969. And my answer has always been that I think of the university as an arena of struggle. Just as I would think about the field of healthcare as an arena of struggle, just as I would, think about uh, uh, the whole question of the prison industrial complex as an arena of struggle. How do we find support in unsupportive places? My sense has always been that we try to challenge the assumption that it is the individual who is the key figure. And particularly those of us who are scholars are encouraged to do our own solitary research and writing. We don't necessarily think about creating communities. And I've always discovered throughout my life that wherever I am, my very first step has to be involved in the creation of community. And therefore, on these university campuses, always find people who are willing to come together and engage collectively. So that you have a support system, so that that somebody always has your back, so that that when you go up before you're going up for tenure or whatever, that you're not by yourself. And that is one of the ways to try to challenge the ideological impact of capitalism, which always emphasizes the individual as the primary unit of society.
Thank you. And I have one last question from Dr. Myrtle Bell, who is a professor of business ethics and associate dean for diversity, racial equity, and inclusion. Dr. Bell asks, what would you recommend to those who are beat down and exhausted? How do you keep going and doing this work when you're feeling tired?
Well, of course, everybody's going to feel tired. But again, I think that the assumption that we are primarily individuals doing this work prevents us from understanding that, yeah, we have to rest sometimes. But if we are part of a collective, if we are part of a community, the work continues. It's not dependent on our individual capacities alone. So that there's that element. And I know that I have remained for so many decades in the struggle because I've always had sisters, brothers, comrades. I've always known that if I have to take a little time off, I can. And that doesn't mean the work will not continue. Now, of course, we have to take care of ourselves physically and mentally and spiritually. And so I think it's important to find ways in which we can engage in what is now called self-care. Excuse me, whether it is, making sure you get enough sleep every night, or, whether it is, practicing yoga with the people with whom you work or the people with whom you organize, whether it is listening to music, which is very restorative. And let me point out that Black music is the gift of African descended people to the world. And that music was born of struggle. That music is also an indication of the fact that the products of struggle also consist of beauty and joy, that we can find ways to restore ourselves in the very process of engaging in struggle. And music is an example, a wonderful example of that.
Dr. Davis, can you hear me? This is Dr. Jason Shelton again.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hey, y'all, let's give the good doctor one more round of applause, all right? You can't hear it. Dr. Davis, you cannot hear it, but I'm looking at it, and I'm sure y'all can all see that there are 150 people online right now. And Dr. Davis, I must say, I know we put down 150 chairs in this room, and over the course of beginning of your lecture, the vast majority of these seats are full, and there's an overflow room across the hall. I'm gonna say it's 200 people in person in the middle of COVID. So I'm gonna say that must not mean what you mean to us. Thank you very much for all that you have done. Y'all, we are about to close things out. Before we do, Dr. Davis, we do have a token of our appreciation that we will be sending in the mail to you. It is a plaque that denotes you as one of our keynote speakers for the Center for African American Studies for our 10th annual conference. Thank you once again. We're gonna drop this in the mail to you. And this is the awkward moment where if you could just hang on for just 2 or 3 minutes, Dr. Davis, we're about to shut things down. But I would like for 2 people to know what I'm about to say with you on the call, okay, Dr. Davis? So just hang around with us for a minute. Before closing out today's conference, ladies and gentlemen, I must thank 2 strong African American women for their contributions to UT Arlington in general and the Center for African American Studies in particular. Melanie Johnson, our esteemed Director of Multicultural Affairs, has accepted a new position outside of UT Arlington. It was an honor to serve on the search committee that selected her a few years ago. The Office of Multicultural Affairs has come a long way under her leadership. Believe me, I've been here a long time. I knew what it was like before. We most certainly hired the right person. Melanie, I don't know where you are. You still in the room, in the back of the room? Thank you for all you've done. We wish you the best in all that you do. I was also on a search committee back in 2014 that hired Ann Hunt Rogers as CAS's administrative assistant. Let's clap it up for her. A few years ago, I remember sitting in the College Park Center when she finished her undergraduate degree. In the years since, she has not only earned her MSW, but is now working on her PhD. She's also teaching courses in the School of Social Work. Thankfully, she's accepted a new position still here at UT Arlington, so we can lean on your wisdom every now and again, Ann. Y'all, let's clap it up for Ms. Ann Hunt Rogers. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, we've passed out a survey that all of you all have received. We've got some social work interns. Where y'all at? Raise your hands, please, our social work interns. Okay, they're either outside at the table. On your way out, ladies and gentlemen, please drop off those surveys. Again, we need them to show the effectiveness of our program. And I know y'all liked our program today, right? With that, Dr. Davis, thank you. Dr. Rayshawn Ray, my man from earlier this morning, thank you too if you're still on the call. Thank you, Dr. Kirby, for organizing the panel discussion this morning and all the folks that sat on your panel. Thank you to Dr. Odom Wesley, City of Arlington, Blaise LaFleur. Hey, y'all, stay safe, stay healthy. See you next year for our 11th anniversary. Have a good one. Bye-bye, Dr. Davis. Appreciate your help.
Thank you.